The silver teaspoon clinked against fine china as steam rose from the cup, carrying with it the bitter scent of more than just Earl Grey. In the grand dining room of the Whitmoreton estate, 17-year-old Priscilla watched her master's lips touch the rim, knowing that with each sip, justice moved closer to his throat. This is the story of a girl who discovered that sometimes the only way to escape hell is to send the devil there first. The morning air in Wilmington, North Carolina, hung thick with the salt-tinged humidity of 1857, while the creak of settling timber and distant clatter of carriage wheels on cobblestone provided the soundtrack to a city built on the backs of the enslaved. Inside the Whitmoreton mansion on 3rd Street, the polished mahogany floors reflected oil lamp flames that danced like spirits seeking vengeance, and the heavy damask curtains trapped the lingering aroma of yesterday's tobacco smoke, mixed with something far more sinister. Priscilla had been 9 years old when Marcella Whitmoreton first purchased her at the Wilmington slave market, a transaction recorded in the courthouse ledger as simply one female Negro child, aged 9 years, $500. What those cold words could never capture was the precise moment when childhood died in a little girl's eyes, replaced by something harder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous. The Whitmoreton household operated with the mechanical precision of a clock wound too tight. Marcella Whitmoreton, a widow of considerable means and even more considerable cruelty, maintained her social standing through a combination of inherited wealth from her late husband's shipping empire and a reputation for hosting the most elegant soirees in Cape Fear society. Her guests, the Crowthavens, the Brackenwells, the Grimsleys, would arrive in their finest carriages, never questioning the source of their hostess's immaculate hospitality. They never saw what happened in the cellar. For 8 years, Priscilla had perfected the art of invisibility, moving through the grand rooms like a shadow, anticipating Marcella's needs before they were spoken, absorbing blows without sound, bleeding without complaint. She learned that survival meant becoming smaller, quieter, more efficient. But she also learned something else, something far more dangerous. She learned to watch, to listen, to remember every cruel word and vicious strike. The other enslaved people in the household, old Moses who tended the garden, Ruth who managed the kitchen, Samuel who maintained the carriages, they whispered warnings to the young girl. "Don't let the fire in your eyes burn too bright," Ruth would murmur while teaching Priscilla to prepare the morning tea service. Mistress Marcella, she got a taste for breaking what she can't own complete. But there were things about Priscilla that even Ruth didn't know. Late at night, when the household slept, the girl would slip down to the kitchen and practice reading by candlelight, using discarded newspapers and letters she'd rescued from wastebaskets. She memorized the locations of every key in the house, cataloged the patterns of every visitor, and, most importantly, she learned about the medicinal herbs in Ruth's garden, particularly which ones could heal and which ones could kill. The turning point came on a sweltering Tuesday in July, when Leonora Brackenwell arrived for her weekly tea visit. Priscilla was serving refreshments when she accidentally brushed against Leonora's silk shawl. The reaction was swift and brutal. "How dare that creature touch me?" Leonora shrieked, her face flushing red beneath her powder. "Marcella, you simply must teach it better manners." What followed was 9 lashes with a riding crop in full view of the drawing room, while Leonora and the other ladies, Arabella Whitlock and Celestine Faircroft, continued sipping their tea and discussing the weather. Not one of them looked away. Not one of them spoke against it. Some lines once crossed can never be uncrossed. That night, as Priscilla tended her wounds with strips torn from her own undergarments, she made a decision that would echo through the annals of Cape Fear County history. She would no longer simply endure. She would act. But her revenge would be patient, calculated, perfect. The plan took 3 months to mature. Priscilla began by cultivating a relationship with Phineas Grimsley, the local apothecary who sometimes supplied remedies for the household. She discovered that he kept meticulous records of his transactions and that certain substances, particularly arsenic used for rat poison, could be acquired in small quantities without raising suspicion. Meanwhile, she observed Marcella's routines with forensic precision. Every morning at exactly 9:15, her mistress took tea in the dining room while reviewing correspondence. The tea service was always prepared by Priscilla alone, a privilege Marcella had granted her after deciding the girl showed proper deference to her station. The bitter irony would soon reveal itself. By October, everything was in place. Phineas Grimsley had unknowingly provided the arsenic through a series of small purchases spread across several weeks. Each transaction carefully disguised as pest control for different areas of the estate. Priscilla had tested the substance's solubility and discovered that when ground to the finest powder, it dissolved completely in hot liquid, leaving no trace to the eye or immediate taste. She chose October 31st, All Hallows' Eve, for reasons that seemed divinely appropriate. But what Priscilla didn't know was that someone else in the household had been watching her with equal attention, someone who would soon face an impossible choice between loyalty and survival. What would you do if you witnessed justice being served by the very hands that had been brutalized for years? How do you weigh the scales when the law itself is the source of injustice? As the church bells of Wilmington chimed 7 times that Halloween morning, Priscilla descended to the kitchen to begin her final tea service, unaware that the next 24 hours would transform her from victim to legend, and that her story would whisper through the corridors of history long after the last witness had died. The reckoning was about to begin. The kitchen knife trembled in Ruth's weathered hands as she watched Priscilla measure the white powder with surgical precision, each grain a small death falling into the silver tea strainer. This was the moment when mercy died and justice took its place at the breakfast table. The pre-dawn darkness of October 31st clung to the Whitmoreton kitchen like a burial shroud, while the steady tick-tick-tick of the mantel clock above the hearth counted down the minutes until 9:15. The cast-iron stove radiated waves of heat that mixed with the sharp scent of bergamot oil and the metallic tang of fear sweat, creating an atmosphere thick enough to choke on. Through the narrow servant's window, the first pale fingers of sunrise painted Wilmington's rooftops in shades of amber and blood. Ruth had been awake since 4 in the morning, as was her custom, preparing the day's bread and tending to the kitchen fires. She'd worked in the Whitmoreton household for 12 years, long enough to recognize the particular stillness that preceded violence. But this morning felt different, charged with an electricity that made her old bones ache with foreboding. "Child," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "You sure about this path you walking?" Priscilla's response came without hesitation, her young face set with a determination that belonged on someone twice her age. "I've been sure since the day she bought me, Ruth. Only difference is, now I got the means." The arsenic, obtained through Priscilla's careful manipulation of Phineas Grimsley's charitable nature, had cost the apothecary nothing more than a few conversations about persistent rodent problems in the estate's various outbuildings. Grimsley, a thin man with nervous hands and a tendency to stutter when speaking to anyone above his station, had never questioned why a slave girl would need such detailed knowledge about pest control methods. "Rat poison works fastest when it dissolved complete," he'd explained during one of their conversations, completely unaware that he was providing a tutorial in murder. 3 grains per cup of liquid should do for the largest vermin. The morning routine proceeded with mechanical precision. At exactly 8:45, Priscilla began heating the water in Marcella's preferred silver kettle, a wedding gift from 1829 that bore the Whitmoreton family crest. The kettle itself had been a witness to countless morning rituals, but today it would serve a darker purpose. Samuel, the carriage driver, appeared in the kitchen doorway at precisely 8:50, as he did every morning, seeking his usual cup of coffee and slice of cornbread before beginning his daily duties. He was a man of 53 years, graying at the temples, with intelligent eyes that missed very little of what transpired in the household. "Morning feels different today," he observed quietly, settling onto his customary stool near the back door. Ruth shot him a warning glance, but Samuel had already noticed the unusual tension radiating from Priscilla's rigid posture. He'd been enslaved on the Whitmoreton property since he was 15, long enough to develop an almost supernatural ability to sense when the delicate balance of plantation life was about to shift. The church bells of St. Payne, James Episcopal, began their 9 o'clock chimes, just as Priscilla poured the boiling water over the tea leaves in Marcella's favorite china pot. Spode blue willow pattern, imported from England at considerable expense. The white powder dissolved instantly, invisibly, becoming one with the amber liquid that had fueled the mistress's morning correspondence ritual for nearly a decade. Death wore the mask of hospitality as the final bell tone faded across Wilmington's morning air. Footsteps echoed from the main staircase. Marcella Whitmoreton descended precisely on schedule, her silk morning dress rustling with each step, her hair already perfectly arranged despite the early hour. At 47, she maintained the bearing of Southern aristocracy through rigid self-discipline and the liberal application of rouge to hide the effects of her nightly bourbon consumption. "Is my tea prepared?" she called from the dining room, her voice carrying that particular edge that meant someone would suffer if the answer wasn't affirmative. Priscilla lifted the serving tray, silver teapot, matching cream pitcher, sugar bowl, and a single cup and saucer, with steady hands. The weight felt different somehow, heavier with purpose. As she moved toward the dining room, Ruth reached out and caught her arm. "Once you walk through that door, child, there ain't no walking back." The moment stretched between them like a taut wire. In the distance, a rooster crowed, and somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked under unseen weight. Samuel watched from his corner, his coffee growing cold in his hands, understanding without being told that he was witnessing history pivot on the edge of a 17-year-old girl's resolve. Priscilla met Ruth's gaze with eyes that had seen too much, endured too much, forgiven too much. "I've been walking toward this door my whole life, Ruth. Today I finally get to walk through it." She entered the dining room at exactly 9:14, 1 minute ahead of Marcella's established schedule. The morning light streaming through the tall windows cast long shadows across the Persian carpet, while the grandfather clock in the corner prepared to chime the quarter hour. Everything appeared normal. The gleaming mahogany table, the fresh flowers arranged in crystal vases, the morning newspapers folded beside Marcella's place setting. But normalcy was about to die with the first sip. Marcella barely glanced up from the letter she was reading as Priscilla set the tea service at her right elbow. "Pour it properly," she commanded, without lifting her eyes from the page, "and mind you don't splash." The tea streamed from the silver spout in a perfect amber arc, filling the cup with liquid justice disguised as morning refreshment. The poisoned brew sat innocently in its delicate china prison, waiting for lips that had spoken 1,000 cruelties to finally taste their consequences. But as Marcella reached for the cup, a knock echoed from the front door, unexpected, urgent, and perfectly timed to shatter Priscilla's carefully orchestrated plan. Who could be calling at the Whitmoreton estate at 9:15 on Halloween morning? And why did their arrival feel like divine intervention, arriving just moments too late? The brass door knocker thundered against oak, with the insistence of fate demanding entry, while Marcella's hand froze inches from the poisoned cup that would never reach her lips. This interruption would transform a simple murder into something far more complex and infinitely more dangerous. The sound reverberated through the Whitmoreton mansion like a gunshot, causing the crystal chandelier in the foyer to sing with tiny, high-pitched chimes, while the scent of morning coffee mixed with the sudden metallic taste of fear that filled Priscilla's mouth. Outside, the cobblestone streets of 3rd Street echoed with the clip-clop of horse hooves and the distant calls of merchants beginning their daily rounds. But inside the dining room, time seemed suspended between intention and interruption. Marcella set down her teacup with deliberate precision, her pale eyebrows drawing together in annoyance. At this ungodly hour? Who could possibly? She gestured sharply toward Priscilla. Answer that door immediately. If it's another solicitor, send them away. Priscilla's heart hammered against her ribs as she realized her carefully orchestrated plan was unraveling with each thunderous knock. 8 years of preparation, 3 months of plotting, and divine justice itself was being delayed by whoever stood on the other side of that mahogany door. The visitor proved to be Mortimer Greybourne, Wilmington's newly appointed deputy sheriff, a man of 35 years with calculating gray eyes and the kind of methodical demeanor that made criminals nervous and law-abiding citizens only slightly less so. He stood on the front porch in his dark wool coat, his badge gleaming dully in the morning light, holding a leather document folder that suggested official business rather than a social call. "Good morning," he said, removing his hat as Priscilla opened the door. "I need to speak with Mrs. Whitmoreton regarding a matter of some urgency." Greybourne had arrived in Wilmington only 6 weeks earlier, transferred from Charlotte after what the newspapers delicately described as administrative disagreements with his former superiors. Local gossip suggested he'd been too eager to investigate crimes that certain prominent families preferred to remain buried. His reputation for thoroughness had preceded him, and already several of Cape Fear County's more questionable business dealings had begun to feel the pressure of his scrutiny. Priscilla led him to the dining room, where Marcella sat rigid with displeasure, her breakfast ritual disrupted, her poisoned tea growing cold in its china prison. The morning light, streaming through the tall windows, illuminated the tension lines around her mouth and the way her fingers drummed impatiently against the polished table surface. "Deputy Greybourne," Marcella said without rising, her voice carrying the chill reserved for unwelcome interruptions. "To what do I owe this disturbance?" Greybourne opened his folder and withdrew several sheets of paper covered in neat handwriting. "I'm investigating reports of suspicious activities in this neighborhood, ma'am. Specifically, unusual purchases from local merchants that don't align with documented household needs. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Phineas Grimsley, it appeared, had grown concerned about the series of arsenic purchases and had mentioned his worries to his wife, who had mentioned them to her sister, who had mentioned them to Deputy Greybourne during his systematic interviews with local business owners. The apothecary hadn't intended to cause trouble. He simply couldn't understand why the Whitmoreton household required such quantities of rat poison when they employed a full-time groundskeeper specifically to handle pest control. According to Mr. Grimsley's records, Greybourne continued, consulting his notes. Someone from this household has purchased arsenic on 7 separate occasions over the past 3 months. That's enough poison to eliminate every rodent in Cape Fear County. Priscilla felt the world tilt beneath her feet. She stood frozen by the doorway, trapped between the dining room, where her carefully planned revenge was dying, and the hallway that offered no escape from the consequences of her actions. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but her feet remained rooted to the Persian carpet like a tree about to be felled. Justice delayed becomes justice denied. Marcella's response came swift and sharp. "I know nothing about any poison purchases. You'll have to ask my servants about household expenditures." Her gaze swept toward Priscilla with the precision of a blade finding its target. "Girl, what do you know about this?" The moment balanced on a knife's edge. Priscilla could confess and face immediate consequences, or she could lie and hope that Greybourne's investigation would lose momentum. But there was a third option, one that had never occurred to her until this precise instant. She could tell the truth about everything. "Deputy," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, "maybe you should sit down for this conversation." Greybourne's gray eyes sharpened with interest. He'd spent enough time in law enforcement to recognize the moment when a case was about to crack wide open. "Why don't you start from the beginning, miss?" "Priscilla. Just Priscilla." She looked directly at him, ignoring Marcella's increasingly dangerous expression. "And the beginning was 8 years ago, when I was 9 years old, and Mrs. Whitmoreton decided she owned more than just my labor." The confession that followed would shake the foundations of Wilmington's polite society and reveal truths that powerful people had spent considerable effort to keep buried. But as Priscilla began to speak, none of them noticed that the poisoned tea had begun to emit a faint, sweet smell, and that someone else in the household was listening from the kitchen doorway, someone who had their own reasons for wanting Marcella Whitmoreton dead. Who else had been planning murder in the Whitmoreton mansion? And what would happen when multiple plots for revenge collided in the cold light of Halloween morning? The words poured from Priscilla's lips like water through a broken dam, each confession more damning than the last, while Deputy Greybourne's pen scratched furiously across paper that would soon become evidence in the most explosive trial Cape Fear County had ever witnessed. This was the moment when silence finally shattered under the weight of 8 years of accumulated horror. The grandfather clock in the corner struck 9:30, as Priscilla's testimony painted a picture of systematic brutality that made even the hardened deputy sheriff shift uncomfortably in his chair. The morning light streaming through the dining room windows seemed to dim with each revelation, while the poisoned tea sat forgotten on the table, growing cold as justice found its voice through the lips of a girl who had been taught to remain voiceless. "She started the beatings the second week I was here," Priscilla continued, her gaze fixed on Greybourne's face rather than Marcella's increasingly pale countenance. "Said she had to break me proper before I could serve in a civilized household. But the beatings weren't the worst part." Marcella's teacup rattled against its saucer as she set it down with trembling hands. "These are lies," she whispered, but her voice carried none of its usual authority. "Fabrications from a disturbed mind." Greybourne held up a hand for silence, his gray eyes never leaving Priscilla's face. "Continue, miss." The cellar beneath the Whitmoreton mansion had served as more than just storage space for wine and preserved foods. According to Priscilla's testimony, it had been transformed into a private chamber of horrors where Marcella indulged her darkest impulses away from the scrutinizing eyes of Wilmington society. Iron shackles mounted to the stone walls, leather straps worn smooth from use, and tools that belonged in no civilized household painted a picture that made Greybourne's jaw clench with barely controlled rage. "County records from 1849 through 56, he said, consulting a different set of papers from his folder, show that 11 enslaved individuals purchased by Mrs. Whitmoreton simply disappeared from the tax rolls. No sales recorded, no deaths registered, no transfers documented." The revelation hit the room like a physical blow. Marcella's composure cracked completely. "You can't prove anything," she stammered. "Slaves run away constantly. Everyone knows that." But Priscilla wasn't finished. She described the midnight screams that echoed through the house's walls, the mysterious stains that appeared on laundry, the way certain household members simply vanished overnight, with no explanation provided to the remaining staff. Old Moses, the gardener, had whispered to her about the unusual fertility of the vegetable garden soil, particularly in the sections closest to the house's foundation. The church bells of St. James Episcopal began chiming 10 o'clock when Ruth appeared in the dining room doorway, wringing her hands in her apron. Her weathered face bore an expression of grim determination that suggested she'd been listening to every word of Priscilla's confession. "Deputy," she said quietly, "there's something else you need to see." Ruth led them through the kitchen and down a narrow set of stairs that Greybourne hadn't noticed during his initial survey of the house. The cellar air was thick with dampness and something else, a sweet, cloying smell that spoke of decay barely masked by lime powder. The stone walls wept with moisture, and in the flickering light of Ruth's oil lamp, dark stains on the floor told stories that no amount of scrubbing had been able to erase. But it was the wooden chest in the far corner that stopped Greybourne cold. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a collection of personal effects that read like a catalog of the disappeared. A child's wooden toy horse, a woman's silver wedding ring, a man's pocket watch engraved with initials that Greybourne recognized from missing person reports filed over the past 7 years. At the bottom of the chest, bound in black ribbon, were pages torn from a journal written in Marcella's distinctive handwriting. October 15th, 1853, Greybourne read aloud, his voice echoing in the stone chamber. The new boy from Charleston proved disappointing. Too much spirit, not enough fear. The lime worked faster than expected. Silence swallowed them whole. The journal entries continued for pages, documenting not just murder, but a systematic pattern of torture that revealed depths of human depravity that challenged belief. Marcella Whitmoreton hadn't simply been a cruel mistress. She had been a predator who used the legal protection of slavery to indulge in acts that would have horrified even the most hardened criminals. "Deputy," Ruth said quietly, "there's one more thing." She pointed toward a section of the cellar wall where the stones looked newer than the rest. "That wall there? It wasn't like that when I first came to work in this house 12 years ago." As the terrible implications of Ruth's observation settled over them like a burial shroud, a new sound drifted down from the floors above, the distinctive creak of the front door opening and closing. Someone had entered the house while they were in the cellar, someone who moved with the careful stealth of a person trying not to be heard. Greybourne drew his pistol and motioned for the women to remain silent. But as they climbed the narrow stairs back toward the kitchen, they discovered that their unexpected visitor had left something behind on the dining room table. Marcella's poisoned teacup, now empty, with a small puddle of liquid spilled beside it, and a note written in an unfamiliar hand, "Justice served at last." TD. Who was TD? And why had they chosen this moment to complete what Priscilla had started? Blood trickled from the corner of Tobias Draymore's mouth as he collapsed beside the mahogany dining table. His final act of vengeance complete, the empty teacup rolling across Persian carpet like a verdict rendered in porcelain and poison. The man who had drunk death, meant for another, had been dead inside for 23 years, ever since the night Marcella Whitmoreton destroyed everything he held sacred. The acrid smell of almonds, bitter and unmistakable, began to permeate the dining room air, while Tobias's body convulsed against the hardwood floor, his leather boots drumming a death march rhythm that echoed through corridors lined with oil paintings of long-dead Whitmoreton ancestors. Deputy Greybourne rushed to the fallen man's side, but even before checking for a pulse, the gray pallor of the stranger's skin and the telltale bitter scent confirmed what they all suspected. The arsenic had found its target, just not the intended one. "Who is this man?" Greybourne demanded, kneeling beside the body while searching the stranger's pockets for identification. The dead man's clothes marked him as gentry: fine wool coat, silk vest, gold pocket watch. But his hands bore calluses that spoke of recent manual labor, and his boots were caked with the red clay soil found only in the eastern counties of North Carolina. Ruth stepped forward, her weathered face pale with recognition. "That's Tobias Draymore," she whispered. "Lord have mercy, I thought he was dead these 20 years past." The story that emerged from Ruth's trembling lips painted a picture of love destroyed by the same cruelty that had shaped Priscilla's young life. In 1834, Tobias Draymore had been Wilmington's most promising young attorney, recently graduated from the University of North Carolina, and engaged to marry Sophronia Cindermere, the daughter of a prosperous merchant family. Their wedding had been scheduled for October 31st, Halloween, of that same year. But Sophronia had also been enslaved on the Whitmoreton property. The revelation struck the room like lightning. Mixed-race relationships, while not uncommon in the antebellum South, existed in a shadowy realm of denial and legal impossibility. Sophronia's pale skin and refined manners had allowed her to pass for white in certain social circles, but Marcella Whitmoreton knew the truth of her parentage and wielded that knowledge like a weapon. Mrs. Whitmoreton found out about the engagement 3 days before the wedding, Ruth continued, her voice barely audible above the grandfather clock's steady ticking. She told Mr. Greybourne that if he went through with the marriage, she'd expose Sophronia's true heritage to every newspaper from Wilmington to Raleigh. Said she'd see them both destroyed rather than allow such an abomination to occur. The confrontation that followed had shattered 2 lives and set in motion a chain of events that culminated 23 years later with poisoned tea and a dead man on Persian carpet. Tobias had chosen love over social standing, arriving at St. James Episcopal on October 31st, 1834, ready to marry Sophronia regardless of consequences. But when the church doors opened at the appointed hour, his bride never appeared. Marcella had sold her the night before to a cotton plantation in Georgia, along with forged documents claiming Sophronia had stolen jewelry from the Whitmoreton estate. He spent every penny he had trying to find her, Ruth said, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. Hired investigators traveled to every plantation between here and Savannah, offered rewards that bankrupted him, never found so much as a trace. The search had consumed Tobias's life, transforming him from a promising young lawyer into a broken wanderer who drifted from town to town, following rumors and chasing shadows. His law practice collapsed, his reputation crumbled, and his family disowned him rather than be associated with his obsessive quest. By 1840, Tobias Greybourne had simply vanished from Wilmington society, assumed dead, or disappeared into the vast wilderness beyond civilized settlement. But he had never stopped searching. Greybourne discovered the answer in Tobias's coat pocket, a worn letter dated just 3 weeks earlier, written in a feminine hand and bearing a return address from a Negro settlement near Fayetteville. The letter began, "My dearest Tobias, I pray this finds you after all these years." Sophronia Cindermere had survived her enslavement, eventually gaining freedom through the Underground Railroad in 1851. She had married, raised children, and built a new life under an assumed name. But she had never forgotten the young lawyer who had been willing to sacrifice everything for love. Her letter to Tobias contained not just news of her survival, but something far more devastating. The truth about Marcella Whitmoreton's systematic murder of enslaved people on the property. "I witnessed things that haunt my dreams," the letter continued. "The cellar beneath her house ran red with innocent blood, and she took pleasure in every scream. I survived only because she sold me before she could finish what she started. But others were not so fortunate." The letter included a list of names, the same names that Greybourne had found in Marcella's journal, along with dates and descriptions that matched the horrific entries they'd discovered in the cellar. Sophronia had been building a case against her former tormentor for years, collecting testimonies from other survivors, documenting atrocities that the law had been powerless to address. Until now, Tobias had arrived in Wilmington that morning, not to drink poison meant for another, but to deliver his own form of justice. The empty vial found in his coat pocket contained enough arsenic to kill a dozen people, suggesting that his original plan had been far more ambitious than suicide. But discovering the house already under investigation, hearing Priscilla's confession, and realizing that justice was finally coming for Marcella Whitmoreton, he had chosen a different path. He had chosen to spare others the burden of murder by taking it upon himself. But as Greybourne knelt beside Tobias's cooling body, searching for additional evidence, his fingers discovered something unexpected sewn into the lining of the dead man's coat. A small leather pouch containing documents that would expose a conspiracy reaching far beyond one sadistic woman's personal cruelties. What secrets had Sophronia's 23-year investigation uncovered, and why had she waited until now to reveal them? The documents hidden in Tobias Greybourne's coat told a story that made Marcella Whitmoreton's individual cruelties seem like a single thread in a tapestry woven from human misery, each name on the pages representing another pillar of Cape Fear County society built on foundations of blood. This was the moment when a local horror revealed itself as something far more vast and organized than anyone had dared imagine. The musty smell of old parchment mixed with the lingering bitter almond scent of cyanide as Deputy Greybourne spread the documents across the dining room table, while outside the tall windows, storm clouds gathered over Wilmington with the promise of rain that would wash the cobblestones clean, but could never cleanse the sins about to be exposed. The leather pouch had contained not just letters, but carefully drawn maps, financial ledgers written in multiple hands, and what appeared to be membership rolls for an organization that had no official name, but operated under the informal title of the Harvest Society. The first document bore the seal of Josiah Crowthaven's shipping company and detailed a business arrangement that turned Greybourne's stomach. Between 1845 and 1856, Crowthaven's vessels had transported damaged goods, enslaved individuals who had been tortured beyond usefulness, from plantations throughout the Carolinas to remote islands off the coast where they simply disappeared from all records. "Jesus Christ," Greybourne whispered, his hands trembling as he read invoice after invoice documenting human cargo that was never intended to reach any legitimate destination. Priscilla leaned over his shoulder, her young face hardening as she recognized names from Marcella's social circle, appearing again and again in the shipping manifests. "Mrs. Brackenwell," she said, pointing to an entry dated March 1854. "She visited here the day before that family of field hands disappeared from the Pemberton plantation. Said they'd been sold south. But they had been loaded onto Crowthaven's ship Perdition and sailed to coordinates that led nowhere civilized vessels ever traveled." The financial ledgers revealed an economy of suffering that spanned 3 states and involved dozens of the South's most respected families. The Grimsleys had provided medical expertise, ensuring victims survived long enough to provide maximum entertainment value. Arabella Whitlock had contributed her knowledge of exotic poisons, transforming murder into an art form that left no traces for authorities to follow. Celestine Faircroft had used her connections to identify potential victims, enslaved individuals whose disappearance would cause minimal disruption to plantation operations. Each entry in the ledgers corresponded to a gathering, a social event where the region's elite would assemble under the guise of normal entertaining, while participating in activities that redefined the boundaries of human depravity. The Halloween gathering of 1857 was to be the society's most ambitious event yet, with victims selected from across the region and transported to a location that promised complete privacy for their festivities. The realization hit Greybourne like a physical blow. Marcella's tea party that morning hadn't been interrupted by his investigation. It had been the prelude to something far worse. "Deputy," Ruth said quietly from her position by the kitchen doorway, "there's carriages coming up the drive." Multiple carriages. Through the dining room windows, Greybourne could see a procession of elegant vehicles making their way toward the Whitmoreton estate. He recognized the Crowthaven family crest on the lead carriage, followed by conveyances bearing the colors and symbols of every major family named in Tobias's documents. They were arriving for their planned Halloween celebration, unaware that their hostess lay dead from her own poisoned hospitality and their conspiracy had been exposed. The sound of wheels on gravel grew louder. Greybourne quickly gathered the documents and thrust them into his coat. "Ruth, take Priscilla and get to the kitchen. Lock the door and don't come out until I tell you." He checked his pistol and realized with growing dread that he carried only 6 bullets against what appeared to be a dozen members of Cape Fear County's most dangerous secret. But Priscilla didn't move toward the kitchen. Instead, she walked to the dining room sideboard and opened a drawer that Greybourne hadn't thought to search. Inside lay 2 more pistols, a hunting knife with a blade sharp enough to split hairs, and a small glass vial filled with the same white powder that had killed Tobias Draymore. "Mrs. Whitmoreton wasn't the only one who planned ahead," Priscilla said, her voice carrying a coldness that belonged on someone 3 times her age. You think I only bought enough poison for 1 cup of tea?" The front door's brass knocker began to sound, not the urgent pounding of morning's interruption, but the measured rhythm of guests expecting to be welcomed into familiar surroundings for familiar pleasures. As the approaching footsteps echoed across the foyer's marble floor, Greybourne realized that the investigation he'd thought was ending was actually just beginning. The documents in his coat contained enough evidence to destroy half of North Carolina's plantation aristocracy, but only if he survived the next hour to deliver them to authorities who weren't already part of the conspiracy. The dining room door began to open, revealing silhouettes against the stormy afternoon light that promised revelations darker than any Halloween nightmare. But as the first figure stepped across the threshold, none of them expected to see Marcella Whitmoreton rising from her chair at the head of the table, very much alive, and smiling with the satisfaction of a predator who had just watched her prey walk willingly into the perfect trap. How had Marcella survived poisoning that killed a man in minutes? And what did her survival mean for everyone who thought justice had finally arrived in Wilmington? Marcella Whitmoreton's laugh rang through the dining room like broken glass as she lifted a second teacup to her lips, the one she'd been drinking from all morning, while her guests unknowingly consumed the poisoned brew meant for her alone. This was the moment when the hunter revealed she had always known she was being hunted, and that every move in the deadly game had been orchestrated by her own cruel design. The storm that had been threatening Wilmington all afternoon finally broke as Josiah Crothaven and his fellow conspirators filled the dining room doorway, their elegant clothes dripping with October rain, while the sound of thunder masked the approaching hoofbeats of a dozen mounted deputies racing toward the Whitmoreton estate. The air crackled with electricity, both natural and human, thick with the scent of wet wool and the metallic tang of fear sweat as the assembled members of the Harvest Society realized their carefully planned Halloween gathering had transformed into something entirely unexpected. "Surprised to see me breathing, Deputy?" Marcella asked, setting down her cup with the same deliberate precision she'd maintained throughout 8 years of calculated torture. "Did you really think a girl who could barely read would outwit someone who's been perfecting the art of poison for 2 decades? The truth spilled from her lips like venom. She had switched the teacups that morning, not out of suspicion, but out of habit. The same paranoid caution that had kept her alive through years of orchestrating others' deaths. The arsenic that Priscilla had so carefully measured had indeed dissolved into Earl Grey tea, but it had found its way into the cup intended for Tobias Draymore, whose arrival Marcella had anticipated and planned for with the same meticulous attention she applied to every aspect of her social calendar. 23 years I've been waiting for that broken fool to find the courage to come calling," she continued, her pale eyes glittering with satisfaction. "Sophronia's letters have been intercepted and copied before reaching him for months. Every word she wrote about building evidence, every name she collected, every detail of her investigation. I knew it all before she put pen to paper." The revelation hit Greybourne like a physical blow. The conspiracy wasn't just wider than he'd imagined. It was deeper, more sophisticated, and had tentacles reaching into institutions he'd never thought to suspect. The Postal Service, the courts, even elements within his own law enforcement community had been compromised by the Harvest Society's influence and money. Priscilla stood frozen by the sideboard, her young face pale with the realization that her 8 years of planning had been anticipated, cataloged, and turned against her from the very beginning. But as Marcella's confession continued, something shifted in the girl's expression. Not defeat, but a cold understanding that made her more dangerous than ever. "You made one mistake," Priscilla said quietly, her voice cutting through Marcella's triumphant monologue like a blade finding flesh. "You assumed I was working alone." The dining room's grandfather clock began chiming 4 o'clock as Samuel appeared in the doorway behind the assembled conspirators, no longer playing the role of subservient carriage driver, but moving with the assured authority of someone who had been planning his own form of justice for far longer than 17 years. In his hands, he carried not reins or luggage, but a shotgun loaded with shells that would scatter Harvest Society members across Persian carpet like leaves in an autumn wind. "Afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," Samuel said, his voice carrying none of the deferential tone the conspirators expected from enslaved lips. "Been waiting a long time for you all to gather in one place." The truth that emerged in the following moments rewrote the entire narrative of the Halloween morning's events. Samuel had been documenting the Harvest Society's activities for over a decade, not as a victim, but as an agent of the Underground Railroad, whose mission extended beyond helping enslaved people escape to ensuring their tormentors faced consequences. His network included abolitionists, freed slaves, and sympathetic law enforcement officials who had been building cases against plantation owners throughout the South. Ruth stepped forward from the kitchen doorway, revealing the deputy she'd been hiding there since Greybourne's arrival, not Wilmington law enforcement, but federal marshals whose jurisdiction superseded local corruption and whose presence meant that the Harvest Society's influence couldn't protect them from justice. The carefully orchestrated Halloween gathering became a carefully orchestrated arrest operation. But even as shackles clicked around wrists that had signed death warrants and voices that had ordered unspeakable cruelties fell silent, Priscilla understood that her own role in the morning's events couldn't be overlooked. She had attempted murder, regardless of her victim's worthiness or her own justifications. The arsenic in her possession, the premeditation her actions demonstrated, the confession she'd given, all of it pointed toward a legal reckoning that would likely end with her own execution. As thunder crashed overhead and rain lashed against the dining room windows, Deputy Greybourne made a decision that would echo through Cape Fear County's legal history. The official report would state that Tobias Draymore had taken his own life after learning of Sophronia's death, consuming poison he'd brought with him, rather than face a future without the woman he'd spent 23 years trying to find. The Harvest Society members would be charged with conspiracy, kidnapping, and murder based on evidence discovered during the investigation of Draymore's suicide. Priscilla's name would appear nowhere in the official record. "Sometimes," Greybourne said quietly as federal marshals led the last of the conspirators toward waiting carriages, "justice requires us to forget certain truths in service of larger ones." The girl who had spent 8 years planning the perfect murder walked out of the Whitmoreton mansion, a free woman, carrying with her the terrible knowledge that freedom's price had been paid in blood that wasn't entirely her own. But freedom, she learned, was a burden as heavy as any chain. They say that on Halloween night, when storm clouds gather over Wilmington and rain falls like tears on 3rd Street cobblestones, you can still hear the echo of silver spoons against china cups coming from the ruins of the old Whitmoreton estate, along with the sound of a young girl humming while she measures something white and bitter into porcelain that will never again hold anything innocent. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.